I was a marine biologist who was the head researcher on a mission to the bottom of the Mariana Trench that no one has ever heard of, and sometimes I reckon it should stay that way. But I am writing this because I don't have much life left in me. I need to get this off my chest. I need to warn people about what we found down here. I need to let people know what was lost. It has been decades since, and I'm still the last one left. There were 4 of us who were sent down by the government to explore the Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the ocean. Everyone who was going had to specifically agree, as this mission was extremely dangerous. A submarine that could withstand going that far under the ocean's surface was built for us. This submarine was huge. It needed a lot of living space since we would be at the seas for days documenting what we found. We each had our own purpose on the mission. Mine was to document and research any sort of fish that we encountered. Mary was a botanist, and Julian was a geologist. Quinn's job was just to drive the submarine and to be our handyman. I joined this expedition in hopes of making our names known. I was curious as to what lived down there, if there was life at all. The first night during the descent, we were all gathered in the middle of the common space, hypothesizing about what we were going to find. An entirely new type of plant, Mary exclaimed. Molten rock maybe, Julian chimed in. What about an entire ecosystem that has somehow been able to survive? I excitedly asked. Oh, wouldn't that be something? Quinn said, with a hint of sarcasm. What about entirely new species? Julian joked. We all laughed at the absurdity of that suggestion. I remember, once we made it down, we cheered. We were one of the very few expeditions that had made it down, and this was a momentous first step towards our new discoveries. This was the dream. The next morning, I was staring out the window of the submarine for any signs of life. Julian and Marie were bickering at the lab station. They had found an interesting rock with some plant growing on it, by the sound of it. It hadn't occurred to me just how dark and eerie the bottom of the ocean would be. It was almost pitch black, except for the small lights at the front for Quinn. There was nothing there, and I mean absolutely nothing. The realization made me anxious and gave me a trickle of dread. We were alone at the bottom of the ocean, thousands of feet away from the mainland, staring through the deep abyss that was the Mariana Trench. We were at the ocean's mercy. I started to dread that we would find something, as finding nothing was better than a sea monster. I pushed those feelings aside. This was an opportunity of a lifetime, and there were no monsters down here. I saw an ugly anglerfish during the descent down, but that was harmless. We might not even find anything. Maybe, at most, just a plant. The next few days were uneventful. While I was studying a strange fish, or at least what was left of it, that I had recently procured, I remember I called Marie over to my lab table because it looked like she could use some entertaining. Hey, what is it? Marie asked. Just want to talk. Look at this deep fish. It's just a husk, I exclaimed with wonder. It looks like all the organs have been sucked out. I was trying to find where they would have exited, as it was a strange occurrence. Was there something down here that had that sort of feeding habit? I was intrigued, yet fearful of the answer. She leaned over in amazement as well, and I could tell that she was thinking the same thing I was. Then, not even seconds after, we were thrown off balance because of something hitting the submarine. Quinn, what's happening? I yelled. Guys, you have to see this. I could sense that he was preoccupied with his fascination with something. The rest of us hurried towards a small control center at the front of the ship. What we were met with was a horrific wonder. At the front of the ship, holding a deep-sea fish like a Capri Sun up in its mouth, was a mermaid. Not like those ones on TV or in the movies. This creature was hideous. It was gray, with scaly skin covered in scars around visible bones. Its skin was wrapped around its body so tight that we could see every bone in its awful body. It was completely bald, with daggers for teeth, and a face that looked like it taped an angler's fish head to its body. The fingers around the now dead fish were black, long, and bony. It had a fin running from its head down past its waist. It just looked like a large fish fin. I was looking at it in disgust, amazement, curiosity, fear, and excitement rolled into one big glob in my chest. I was in disbelief. Had we really discovered an entirely new humanoid species at the bottom of the Mariana Trench? Were there more? That question was soon answered when our radars picked up an extremely high frequency at the same time that the mermaid swam away. The sight of the mermaid is still burned into my brain. While all of us looked after it in its splendor, a realization hit me, one that would mean the end of us. We're not alone anymore. We had started tailing the mermaid as we went to see what was calling it and where it was going. The mermaid led us to an entire pod of mermaids just like it. They were all different sizes, and as I examined the group further, it looked like there were some babies with them. The mermaid we saw was one of the smaller ones. It was being called home by its mother. This was a find of a lifetime and an entirely new species. Quinn didn't get too close, so he wouldn't scare them off. We followed the mermaid pod for a few days. They seemed aloof to our presence, and it looked like they didn't need to eat much, since they moved pretty slowly. They also never went up for air once, and we could not see any gills, so we knew that they had some other way to get oxygen. With how hideous they were, they seemed to be extremely benevolent and not worth the fear I felt earlier. Although, soon that gravely changed. By the end of the third day, we had gotten so much information by just observing them, but we were still hungry for more. Unfortunately, we could not sedate that hunger because there was another sound on the radar that made the mermaids flee. Except this time, it was much lower, and even we could feel the vibrations through the submarine rattling through our bodies. This song made a xylophone out of my ribcage. Everyone else thought nothing of it, and Quinn started the journey towards the surface. They started talking about how they could not wait to expose their findings to the government and the public. I was happy to oblige, because I dreaded finding out what was above the mermaids on the food chain. About halfway to the surface, the submarine was violently shaken. I felt like we were in a giant washing machine. I thought we hit a rock, and it looked like my theory was proven when I saw Quinn turning the front of the submarine in a different direction. We all ignored it and continued on, relishing our discoveries. That didn't last long as we heard the exit hatches rip open. I was not terribly worried, as luckily, there was another door that had to be opened in order to actually enter the submarine. Then, there was an incredible banging on the barrier between us and the ocean. As I started to panic, Julian was prepared to see what happened. We waited in agonizing silence for Julian's return, as the worst possible scenarios were running through my head. Quinn was trying his best to rocket us to the top. Bang, 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 pop! Julian's blood-curdling scream erupted from the far back of the submarine as water came thrashing in. That was the last thing anyone heard from him. As the water whisked away his smoking, melted bones, we saw the mermaids. They started swimming towards us now, with menacing snarls, as the submarine started to sink. They were no longer novel, majestic creatures, but ones out for blood. Marie and I ran into the lab to look for anything to fight them with, now knee-deep in ocean water. My blood was making a symphony in my ears, and my heart raced. Marie threw an X-ray machine at two of them, but they continued to rush in. Quinn, in the control room, put the sub on autopilot and came back to help. One of the mermaids grabbed Marie and threw her against the wall. Others proceeded to pounce on her. I could still hear her screams every time I closed my eyes. My heart was threatening to burst out of its cage. Quinn and I ran and took shelter in the control room, holding the door. That low, bone-rattling sound penetrated the submarine. The mermaids quickly disappeared, and I let out a deep breath, not realizing that I was holding it. "Something's wrong," Quinn said urgently. "No one except us is left in the submarine. As weird as it is, they should have just continued to try to kill us." He was right. We both looked at each other with acute awareness of the situation. They weren't attacking us out of nowhere. They were scared. They were trying to escape, and we were in their way. Escape from what? I wish I never found out. Quinn went to close the entrance hatch to stop the water. Fortunately, the mermaids figured out that that wasn't a safe place to be relieved of whatever they were running from. I called for an SOS, explaining that we were in danger. We needed to alert the mainland, get help. I was over being in the ocean. We thought that would be the end of the carnage. We felt ourselves start to sink, but not like before. This time, it felt like we were nearing the edge of an extremely strong whirlpool. How is that possible? We were only 3/4 of the way up, nowhere near the surface. Quinn rushing in, feeling the same thing, strained against whatever was pulling us down. During the tug of war, the otherworldly monster could be seen in the peripheral of the front window. As I could see it better, my jaw became slack. It was a giant brown blob. The front half just an open mouth. The size of it was 2 houses lined up next to each other, and another 2 on top of those. It looked slimy and had large bumps and boils that littered its skin. It was using its mouth like a vacuum, sucking in its prey. Immediately, a squirming, struggling mermaid zoomed past the side window. It looked like a worm on a fishhook, aware that it was in danger, yet still desperate to live. This is what the mermaids were so afraid of. As greatly reinforced glass of the front windows, they started to crack. Fear chilled my skin and raised the hair on the back of my neck. I went to the supply room to try to find air tanks and scuba gear, as we were high enough that the water pressure wasn't a concern if we left the submarine. I was gearing up as I heard a sharp shatter of broken glass, water flinging me back, and watched as Quinn clamped the edges of the submarine for his life. Since the water was so strong, it kept me back. I could do nothing as I watched him grow unconscious from the lack of air and eventually swirl back into his grave in the monster's mouth. He was the 3rd person I watched die that day. I struggled to put the air mask on just in time as I felt the pull of the ravenous monster. My stomach felt like it would be ripped from the rest of my body. I felt myself starting to go and held on anything I could. I did not want to die alone in the middle of the ocean. The monster's will was too strong. My fingers started to slip. Now I only had one hand on the bar that I was holding onto. 2 fingers left. I was not prepared to die. I slipped into the deep, dark abyss. Something inside me made me strong enough to swim against the monster's wrath, leaving behind the sinking submarine and all of our research with it. It felt too strong to be adrenaline. My muscles ached and my lungs burned as I fought my way to the surface. Somehow, some way, I made it to the top. I took the biggest breath of my life as my head broke the surface. I was greeted with a rope and ladder in front of me and the sound of a helicopter. My SOS worked. I climbed up the ladder, incredibly happy to live another day. "What happened down there?" the pilot shouted as the only other person in the helicopter put a towel around me. I was in shock. I didn't know how to respond. Something awful was all I could muster. The pilot glanced back, confused. "Aren't there more of you?" "They're gone," I muttered distantly. He turned back and continued to the mainland. I was still in shock. I lied about what I saw. I lied to my superiors that the others were stupid enough to leave the submarine. I lied that they died on their own free will, and that was better than the truth. I lied that the submarine sank from Marie forgetting to close the escape hatch when she died. I lied about why I abused alcohol. I did it to forget. I lied about cheating on my husband, just to feel something else besides guilt. I'm writing this to you in an empty house, a house that lost all its joy and curiosity of the world. All I feel is guilt. I should have joined their carcasses at the bottom of the ocean. The only thing that gave me solace is that all the research is at the bottom of the ocean, where it should stay. Although now, it isn't as comforting. People should know what lies at the abyss. People should rightfully fear it. People should never confront it. So with my last breath, I'm warning you. Don't be idiots like us. Don't let your curiosity get the best of you. Sometimes, things are just not meant to be discovered.